Hi everyone. This video is going to cover a lot of ground in our continued exploration of poetry. I've chosen the poems we're reading carefully. Blake's London represents England and Romantic British poetry and the legacy that Blake brought to the US. And then there's Emily Dickinson, often called the mother of American poetry for her revolutionary style. She was way ahead of her time in the late 1800s, writing in isolation in her parents' house in Amherst, Massachusetts. To characterize the early 20th century and put before us one of America's most treasured poets, we have Robert Frost's Out Out. And then lastly, we'll look at how poetry continues to permeate popular culture by looking at Kendrick Lamar's Institutionalized, a song which has a surprising number of parallels to Blake's London. I'm also going to, before we do that, touch base on some aspects of Terence Hayes' Carp poem, another contemporary poem that we've already read and digested. On top of these poems, we'll be applying some of the terminology we developed an understanding of last week, and I look forward to seeing you use that terminology to explain what you see going on in these works. Meanwhile, I'm going to thread the needle of telling you enough, but not too much, about these poems so that you can gain some insight without being told what I think they mean. First, let's talk about Carp poem, since it's likely, at this point, that we've all read that one. I've made mention that a poem is a writer's mind at work, making connections that weren't there before. This is clear in Carp poem as Hayes walks us through his experience of going into a juvenile prison and being reminded of first Japan and then a Christian image, a biblical passage, the famous verse likely pulled from Matthew chapter 14 that depicts Christ walking on water. He uses that reference, which we call an allusion with an A, or an indirect reference to another literary work, to deepen his poem beyond the page it's written on, and to add, rather efficiently, an entirely new layer of meaning. That poetry for these boys is like food thrown to hungry carp, or a different kind of food, the food Christ offered through his miracles, the hope of salvation. One does not need to be religious to read and understand this poem this way. The reference has depth because of its context in the poem and the speaker's specific experience. Now, let's quickly touch on William Blake's London. This comes from his collection Songs of Experience, which Blake illustrated himself, adding some pretty cool imagery to accompany his poems. I want to leave you room to interpret, but London depicts a kind of regimented poverty, a society turned upside down. Despite all the chartering going on in the first stanza, woe and weakness prevail. Then we have a church who turns away those who most need it, and a kingdom that turns away those who work to protect it. All of this, Blake tells us, is the result, or perhaps the cause, of, quote, mind-forged manacles. Manacles being chains. This means that it's the people's own minds that imprison them. Going back to the line about the soldiers, quote, the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls, unquote. I want to quickly point out another poetry technique at work here called synesthesia, or the mixing of the senses. Here we have sighs, something we hear, turning into blood, something we can see and feel. While at first this poem may seem like a typical poem that we'd get in a class that surveys literature, I want you to think for a moment about how interesting and strange and descriptive that image is. A soldier's sigh, perhaps of weakness and woe, transforming into blood running down a palace wall. A palace the soldier is supposed to protect. Let's bring it back now to a poem by Emily Dickinson, Because I Could Not Stop for Death. This obviously is using the literary technique of personification, personifying death, but I want you to notice the ways that this poem uses symbolism and symbols. This carriage that sets out, presumably on a date, is headed for immortality, a realm beyond the mortal. And there are certain stanzas that stand out in a way to show the kinds of symbolism at work. Take this one, quote, we passed the school where children strove at recess, in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. In these lines we're brought from the playful beginning of life to the world of work when we think of the gazing grain, all those people out there harvesting for lifelong nourishment, and then, of course, ending with the setting sun. This poem has always felt to me like a spell cast on my consciousness, like Dickinson is reaching beyond the confines of her own life, which ended in 1886, to grab hold of me. The journey it takes us on, this little eternal carriage ride, this narrator who's chilled by death but somehow receptive to it, or rather him. It's a voice from beyond the grave, filled with lively imagery and sweeping in scope, and pretty creepy at times. I love it. Now, let's quickly touch on Frost. If we had the time, I'd probably have us read 10 more of his poems. They're complex, literary, yet always somehow very relatable. They don't try to be evasive or obscure or smarter than you are. I recommend his work highly. This poem, Out Out, employs blank verse. That means it's in what's called unrhymed iambic pentameter. That is 5 two-syllable feet per line. See last week's video for more of this. If you don't believe me, you can check. Each line has 10 syllables. Clap hands like you did in elementary school to count them, and you'll see 10 claps per line. This is a mode favored by many traditional poets, and Frost works on a traditional theme, the value of an individual human life. I'll leave the closer analysis of this one to you, and I'll point out instead an allusion that you may find helpful. The title is a reference to Shakespeare's Macbeth, and in particular, Macbeth's most famous speech. Right after he learns that Lady Macbeth dies, spoiler alert, he laments the brevity and pointlessness of life, saying, quote, "Out, out, brief candle. Life is but a walking shadow," etc., etc. We'll get to the rest of it later. But suffice it to say, Macbeth presents a grim view of life in general. And here's the kicker. Like much of Shakespeare's characters' important speeches, he does it in blank verse. Okay. My point in including Kendrick here is not to be humorous or snarky at all. Anyone who's deeply familiar with his work knows that he's one of the most important poets we have working today. The fact that he's a rapper doesn't take away from that. It gives him a much larger platform. I mean, from the 1920s to the 1960s, everyone knew who Robert Frost was. He was as famous, perhaps, as Kendrick is today. School children memorized his poems, and his books enjoyed a large following upon release. Who is the poet of today to match Frost's fame? She likely doesn't exist purely as a poet. So we have artists who use music as an avenue for their writing, and I believe Kendrick is one of those artists. And that's not to take away from his gifts as a rapper, which are significant. I'm just saying, poetry through music is going to reach more ears than pure poetry here in the 21st century. That said, I think we can see a lot of parallels between the most recent poem we're talking about, Kendrick's Institutionalized, and the oldest, Blake's London. I need only to bring back 3 words from Blake to support this claim. Mind-forged manacles. In Lamar's little parable, told through many voices, Lamar himself plays the successful rapper, the one who made it out of his original oppressive upbringing and has potentially broken free from those mind-forged manacles. In hopes of bringing his friends out with him, he asks them to accompany him to the BET Awards. But the manacles persist for these friends, who see the chains and jewelry all around them as ripe for the taking. They're probably thinking, that 100K chain could feed my family for 2 years. And so are thinking of crime when they could be making connections. Their mindset is not necessarily their fault. It's been shaped by the environment they've lived in. Just as the poor Londoner suffers under the chains of his or her upbringing and experiences, this is what the city produces. A world turned upside down. Just as Blake's final stanza gives us a complete overturning of the most intimate human connection, that of mother and child, Lamar gives us a bastardization of friendship, unity, and connection, caused by the capitalist underpinnings of society. The have-nots cannot pretend to be the haves, even for a night, because they have been conditioned, or institutionalized to live and act in accordance with their conditions.